Greetings and salutations, everyone. After a very long while, we are finally back. I've recently moved out of my sister's place out at the very edge of the world and back to beautiful, sunny Aberdeen, Washington. A big priority of mine was to establish a decent soundproof studio space so I could continue doing this, recording hopefully decent quality audio and video for all of you lovely viewers out there to enjoy. But the challenge was to do this inside of a rented space without doing any major construction and without violating any terms of my lease. I have filmed the entire process and compiled the entire journey into this vlog sort of thing, in hopes that it might be useful to some aspiring musician types like myself. Some of my ideas worked, some of them didn't. I experimented, and I changed my mind a bunch of times along the way. So, join me now on this voyage. So here I am in my new place. I just rented it today. I haven't moved any of my stuff into it yet at all. So my first impression is that it's a pretty noisy neighborhood. We got a lot of neighbors with dogs all barking and stuff. We got a neighbor with the motorcycle that's pretty loud. We're pretty close to a main street. So my first impression is that I want to soundproof one of these bedrooms. And I'm not sure exactly how I'm going to go about doing it yet or which room it's going to be. I think that this one over here is closer to the alleyway, so it isn't right on the main street. You'll have less traffic noise, but you'll have the neighbor's barking dog right outside there. This other bedroom is the one that's closer to the street traffic. It's a little bit bigger, a little bit more room, so I think this would also be a pretty good choice. So just from the little bit of research that I've done, the best method that I've heard of so far is to add more mass to the walls, which is usually in the form of an extra layer of drywall and adding better insulation. And since this is a rental and I can't modify it too heavily, I had kind of a strange idea, a strange concept of how I want to do this. So what I would like to do first is to put a plug over the window that will just keep some of the noise out from the old windows. These are definitely not energy efficient or soundproof at all. I think they're just single pane windows. They're pretty old. So I'm going to put something in the window space first just to seal that up better. And then my concept was to build sort of a false wall in front of the existing wall, and to keep that in place by just making it super tight from the floor to the ceiling, starting off framing it in with some 2x4s, adding insulation between the studs, and then installing a layer of 5/8 drywall over the top of that. And then once I have the drywall installed, it's been recommended to me to use carpet glue as an extra soundproofing layer just to add more mass to the surface of the drywall. And then once the carpet glue has dried, then we'll add a second layer of 5/8 drywall over the top of that. So from the existing exterior wall, no idea how well that's insulated, no idea how thick the drywall is, but I'm assuming that it's only a 1/2 inch. Over the top of that, we're going to have a layer of insulation, and we're going to have a layer of drywall, a layer of carpet glue, a second layer of drywall, a second layer of carpet glue, and then we're going to paint it. And then over the top of that, we're going to have some regular soundproof foam panels just to catch some of the reflections inside of the room and kind of deaden the reverberation from the noise that I'm creating inside the room. So here I am a few days later. I'm kind of starting to get cold feet about the whole idea of building new walls in front of the walls inside my rental. Just for the fact that I've been told that there might be some people stopping by every now and then to inspect this and that, to repair this and that. And if anybody sees my construction project here, they might freak out a little bit, right? So I have a new, different idea. And These here 2x4s that I cut are going to be about the width of my computer desk workstation. And I just decided, instead of going for the entire width of the wall to wall, I would just go about the same width as the computer desk, or maybe a little bit wider than that, and kind of build myself a small cubicle and do all of my soundproofing insulation and drywall tricks on a smaller cubicle, kind of in the center of the room. That way, if somebody comes in to inspect and they see it, it doesn't look like I'm doing a major construction project in here. It is definitely specifically something that is temporary and can be removed at a later date. So before I just start cutting up a bunch of lumber, I wanted to make a mock-up of what it's actually going to look like just on the floor plan here. I have a pretty considerable background in building stuff. I've worked in construction trades for most of my life. So this is all, pretty business as usual for me. You want to make sure you have a really good plan before you just get started here. So one thing I definitely wanted to consider is that I wanted to make sure that the entire thing would be exactly 8x8. So I'm going to go through and I'm going to cut off the first 7 inches or so on the end of 2 of the pieces. That when you put it all together, it's accounting for the width of the 2x4, which is 3.5 inches, and you have 2 of those on either side. So you want to cut off 7 inches total to make the entire thing exactly 8x8 square. And the reason for this is because the sheets of drywall that we're going to be using are exactly 4 feet wide. So we don't want to have an extra third sheet of drywall that we have to cut a thin piece out of because we accidentally made the entire thing 7 inches bigger than it needed to be. So we just make it a little bit shorter, so it's just 2 sheets of drywall per side, and that will fit evenly. So I've just gone ahead and I've just made a mark every 24 inches, and this is going to be where our stud placement is going to be. And the reason that it's 24 inches is because the insulation that I'm using is 24 inches wide. So we want to make sure that the studs are spaced evenly so the insulation fits tightly in between each one. And then we have this little section here is going to be cut out for the doorway. See, cut out for doorway. And I've just measured the doorway of the room, just a standard door size, about 32 inches I think it was. And we're just going to make the opening that same size, so we have an access point to actually get into here, because it would be pretty stupid to build a gigantic box and then not have a way to get inside of it. So this piece over here is going to be a little bit shorter, and it's only going to have 4 studs for this section instead of the other sections which have 5 studs. The other thing we have to consider is we have this light fixture. I'm not going to take that down. I'm just going to make the entire enclosure fit directly underneath it. So that's going to require some pretty careful measuring. So it's a little shy of 7 feet from the floor all the way to the bottom of this light fixture. We also need to make sure that we're allowing ourselves enough room to have our stud fit underneath there. So we want to make sure that we have room for this, and then bring it down about 1.25 inches, something like that, because we also have to account for there being a layer of 5/8 drywall on top of it, if not 2 layers of 5/8 drywall. So we want to make sure that we're not wasting any space. We want to make sure that we're going to make this as tall as it possibly can be. That way it's not kind of cramped to be inside of there, and maybe I'll be able to stand up inside of it, but we also want to make sure that there's room for our 2x4 and also room for drywall to go on top of the 2x4 as well. And one more thing that we want to consider too is that we're using 2x4s for our framing, and the insulation that I got for this project is for 2x6 walls. As you can see right there, it shows you the exact dimensions of this insulation. So my thinking was that if we got the insulation that's meant for 2x6 walls and we crammed it as tight as we can into 2x4 framing, this insulation has the ability to be squished down, and it kind of compacts inside the framing. I think that might provide better soundproofing if we just have more mass of insulation inside the walls. So that's why I got 2x6 insulation for 2x4 framing. It will take a little bit of effort to kind of squish all the insulation inside of the walls, and it'll be packed really tight inside of there, but I think that will work to our advantage in the end. So something we need to consider when we're taking our measurement from the floor all the way up to the bottom of this light fixture is we want to make sure that we're taking the height of our 2x4 here on edge, which would be about 1.5 inches. And then we want to double that. So it's going to have a top plate and a bottom plate for the wall. So we want to take that all together is 3 inches. And we want to just subtract that from our measurement that we take from the floor up to the bottom of the light fixture, because the studs are going to go between our bottom plate, and then it's also going to have another piece of the 2x4 on top of it too. So we want to make sure that our studs that we're cutting fit between those two plates. And then our studs for the ceiling are going to kind of go across, but also be at the same height as the top plate for the walls. And then we do have to make sure that we have enough room for at least 1 layer of 5/8 drywall, if not 2 layers, on top of this entire enclosure. So we want to take our stud height, we want to subtract our double thick 2x4s, and we also want to subtract another about 1.5 inches off of that. And that will be our final stud height. So I'm measuring it now, kind of hard to keep it all straight, but it looks like we have about 80.5 is as tall as we can possibly make the entire thing. So we subtract 3 inches from that, be it 77.5, and another inch off of that, 76.5. So about 76.25, 76.5 is how tall we're going to want to cut all these studs. And according to the layout that I've made, all these marks that I've made at 24 inches on center, we're going to need about 19 studs. So I've also just gone ahead and cut my pieces for the window plug that I'm going to build here as well. You'll see that I've also marked these out. So 24 inches on center. I know that I'm going to need 5 pieces, 5 vertical studs, if you will, for this window plug. And I've cut them so that it has room on the bottom and it has a little bit of room on top for another 2x4, so you can literally measure the entire height of the window and then also just subtract 3 inches from it, and that will be your perfect height for the studs. So something else that I realized about our layout here is that if we're going to be putting a 32-inch opening for a doorway and we're going to be putting it just directly over here on the corner, then rather than having an extra piece that we add right here to create the right-hand edge of the door frame, we're just going to use the end of this wall as the right-hand support for our door frame. So instead of cutting this back 7 inches, just like we're cutting the other side back 7 inches, we're actually going to cut this back 3.5 inches. That way we still have 3.5 sticking out further than the other side. That way this edge comes out a little bit further and it lines up parallel with this wall and everything meets in the corner nicely, so it's still a nice square edge. And the entire thing will still be 8 feet by 8 feet exactly. Hopefully that makes sense. So we're just going to cut all of these pieces that I have marked out. The one on that side we're going to cut down 7 inches. The one on this side we're going to cut down 3.5 inches, and then we're taking 35.5 off the end of this. That way we have our 32-inch doorway, and we also have the width of our 2x4, which is actually 3.5 inches. So this total space is going to be 35.5 that we cut off of there. And we're going to make all those pieces in duplicate. That way we have our bottom plate, and that way we have a top plate for the top of the wall. And then we're going to go and cut all of our studs at the measurement that we took from the floor up to the light fixture. And we're going to need 19 studs for the entire thing. So that means that I'm probably going to be taking a trip back to the Home Depot to get more tubifers, because I don't think that I bought enough to make all of these studs. So before we do any of the framing work in here, I'm just going to lay down some flooring protection. I get this contractor grade, super heavy duty floor paper. I mean, this is kind of expensive, so if you were doing your own project, you could probably use something a lot cheaper, but this is what I like to use. And this is just going to keep it from making any mess on the carpet that I won't be able to clean up. That way we'll be able to do our drywall mud, our paint, our carpet glue layer, all of that without having to risk anything getting onto the floor and ruining the carpet permanently. And this is kind of what it looks like once the floor paper is down. I just went ahead and used some masking tape on the seams so we could seal up any gaps and cracks where any dust or any paint could get onto the carpet, but it's not perfect right now. The tape is kind of starting to separate, so we'll just go ahead and tape that better at a later date after the framing is all done. For now it's in place, and we'll be able to build right on top of this and not have to put down paper later. If we put it all down first before we start framing, then we won't have to worry about any gaps at the bottoms of the walls or anything. All the paper will be underneath the framing, and then once we're done, we can just kind of cut away the excess around the edges. If that doesn't make sense, if you're not following along with what I mean, then I'm sure you will see what I mean. You'll understand when we get to that point later on in the project. And here we have the framing assembled. The only thing that I modified from my original design is I put a little piece across the top up here just to kind of hold the two walls together a little bit better, and I put a little block up here to support it. I added 5 supports across the top, and again, that's because we're going to want to insulate the ceiling of this. So we want to have room to put insulation in between here and there. So they're about 24 inches on center. I kind of goofed up when I was putting the side walls in. You'll see that on this side, the ceiling supports did not match up with the stud pattern on the wall. And I think that my original layout was accounting for this, but I think they just have this entire wall over here flipped backwards the wrong way. So you can kind of see like the stud pattern should have started over on that side and been 24 inches on center, but I accidentally just installed the wall the wrong direction. So now it's 24 inches on center from that side, which is not lining up on the other end over here. But it's fine. I got it together anyway. It's definitely good enough for me. So I think that's enough talking about the framing. If you don't understand the process of framing walls, I'm sure there's plenty of other videos out there that will help you in more in-depth detail than what I'm able to provide here. So next we're going to move on to the drywall. I want to put ideally 2 layers of drywall on the outside and 2 layers of drywall on the inside. Again, with insulation sandwiched in between there. And between each layer of drywall, we're going to smear it with some carpet glue. That way there's just all sorts of mass and protection and all this good stuff that's going to go to make the walls more soundproof. Now, 2 layers of drywall on the inside and the outside is going to be rather expensive. This whole thing is going to take 10 sheets of drywall in order to cover 1 layer. So 10 sheets times 4, that's 40 sheets of drywall just on this little box. Each sheet of 5/8 drywall is about $20 at our local Home Depot. So you can do the math on that. It's going to be pretty expensive to do that. About $800 just in drywall sheets alone. And I might simplify the design a little bit. I'm not really sure yet, but I'm going to start by putting 1 layer on the inside and then 1 layer on the outside, and then kind of giving it a test and see how soundproof that is, and then add more mass to it if I feel like the design needs improvement from there.
So I didn't do a great job of taking video during the drywall process. I had a friend over helping me. It started becoming a little bit of a complicated and messy job, so I didn't really get much video, but I got some nice pictures, so I'll just show some pictures of the process on the screen right now. I also wanted to mention how much money this has been costing me so far. So we have 36 tubifers at $4 each, which is $144. I've bought 20 sheets of drywall just to put one layer on the inside and one layer on the outside walls, and that comes up to $400 at $20 per sheet. I got 2 packs of insulation for $260, about $60 for the carpet glue, about $35 for the floor protection. Add another $60 or so for random screws, tape, and drywall mud. That brings us to a total of $959 so far. There were definitely some other expenses that I'm not taking into account here, and a few more things I bought that we haven't covered yet in the video so far, as far as acoustic foam panels, building and painting the computer desk, paint for the walls, a little scrap carpet for the floor. So we're actually in the neighborhood of $1,200 to $1,400 for the finished job.
So a few changes that I made during the drywall process here. I ended up having to add a few extra pieces of wood on the edges of this wall and the corners there. Just that way I had something to screw the drywall into, just the way I had my framing planned out. There was no stud on the corner there facing the right direction. So I had to add some extra pieces just for the drywall backer, just for something to screw it into. And also you can see there's an extra stud right here. That's just because the seam and the 2 sheets of drywall did not land where I wanted it to. So we just added an extra little piece of wood there, so we had, again, something to screw the edge of the sheet to. And also over in this corner, I did the same thing. These are just ends of 2x4s that I had in my scrap pile, and they don't have to really be in there super structurally sound. As you can see, I just kind of screwed them in there. Just that way the edge of the drywall has something to rest against and something to be screwed into. I also added another piece of wood down here on the bottom just to tie the doorway together. It started getting pretty heavy with the sheets on the outside, and it's going to get even heavier with the rest of the drywall installed. So that was making the point where these 2 walls come together kind of wobbly and wonky. So I just put an extra piece of wood down there on the bottom. If I had to do it again, and I kind of should have known better, but if I had to do it again, I would have just planned to make the bottom plate and the top plate. You can't really see it. But I would have planned to make the bottom plate and the top plate just go all the way across from right to left, and then just put a gap in between the studs. That's how I should have done it, but you know, I wasn't thinking straight when I was making the plan for it in the first place. The proper way to do it is to have a top plate and a bottom plate go all the way from the right to the left on the bottom in one solid piece.
So after we finished putting a layer of drywall on the outside of the enclosure, then it was time to start putting some insulation between all the studs. And as I mentioned before, it's a bit of a complicated process if you're going to put insulation that's designed for 2x6 walls into walls that are framed with 2x4s. Obviously, you're going to have to squish that down quite a bit in order to make it fit. But the advantage of this is it's a lot more mass compacted inside of our framework, and that is obviously going to be much better for our soundproofing purposes. So it was very useful to have a second person helping me. That way we could both push against the sheet of drywall, squishing the insulation down and getting the sheet nice and tight against the studs before screwing it in. Doing the ceiling was a bit easier since we have access from above. We were able to just hang the sheets of drywall on the ceiling as usual and then install the insulation from the top. We're only about halfway done at this point, but I didn't want the video to run much longer than 30 minutes or so, so we're going to wrap it up here and stay tuned for part 2. Like and subscribe, pretty please, if you're feeling charitable, and thank you very much for watching.